Welcome to the world of Carry On. In this series, we're going to take a look behind the scenes at how some of the greatest Carry On films were ever made. In this episode, we look at Carry On Dick, but first, let's look who's going to provide the laughs, or who was ready to stand and deliver. Sidney James as the Reverend Flasher, aka Dick Turpin. Barbara Windsor as Harriet. Kenneth Williams as Captain Desmond Fancy. Hattie Jakes as Miss Hoggett. Bernard Bresslaw as Sir Roger Daly. Joan Sims as Madame Desiree. Kenneth Connor as the Constable. Peter Butterworth as Tom. And Jack Douglas as Sergeant Jock Strap. Carry On Dick was the 26th Carry On film in the series. It was the 20th and final Carry On script by Talbot Rothwell. And we also said goodbye to 3 Carry On legends, Sid James, Hattie Jakes and Barbara Windsor, who would all go on to make their final appearance in this film. Although only one Carry On film, Carry On Girls, was put into production in 1973, producer Peter Rogers had already commissioned a title from writers George Evans and Laurie Wyman in the May of that year. They were best known for the BBC radio comedy The Navy Lark, and their idea was a rather predictable Carry On Sailor. The idea was scrapped, but not before the writers had been paid £1,000 for their trouble, and as a result they wrote a script based on Dick Turpin legend, which involved the ill-conceived robbery of the Bank of England. Talbot Rothwell kept the flavour of the script, but for all intents and purposes rewrote his own Don't Lose Your Head script for the final article. Talbot Rothwell delivered the completed manuscript for the following February, and it was conceived as the first in a new 3-year film deal with Peter Rogers. Talbot Rothwell was set to write a further 5 carry-ons under that agreement. However, while typing up the first draft for Carry On Dick, the writer suffered an attack of nervous exhaustion and was told to rest by his doctor. His daughter Jane typed the final draft of the script for the notes and dictation, and Talbot Rothwell sadly would never write another Carry On. Many of the artists involved in Carry On Dick, such as Sid James, Barbara Windsor, Bernard Bresslaw, Kenneth Connor, Jack Douglas and Peter Butterworth, were all starring in the Carry On London West End play at the Victoria Palace, which meant a very tight schedule to get them to the theatre on time was put in place. Despite the limited shooting time per day, the schedule was typically tight, with just 29 days in studio and 10 on local location. The exteriors and interiors for Sid's Rectory were filmed at Stoke Manor, Stoke Poges. However, the most inviting location was that of the pub that was used where Jack Douglas got dumped in the horse trough, the Jolly Woodman at Littlewood Common in Buckinghamshire. Many say that it still has its charm and still can serve a good Sunday lunch. On the 11th of December 1974, Peter Rogers threw a Carry On party, reuniting the stars of the West End hit show Carry On London and those that were featured in Carry On Dick. At this point, Gerald Thomas announced plans for the next film, but almost half of those present would not appear. Indeed, this proved to be the final gathering of the core Carry On gang. So, let's find out what Carry On Dick was all about. In the year 1750, England is rife with crime and highway robbers. To stop the wave of chaos, King George II sets up the first professional police force named the Bow Street Runners, under the command and watchful eye of Sir Roger Daly. The second, Captain Desmond Fancy, and the Sergeant Jock Strap. The runners are all apparently successful in whipping out crime and lawlessness, using a manner of traps and tricks. However, their main target is the notorious Richard Big Dick Turpin, a highwayman who has evaded capture and succeeded in even robbing Sir Roger Daly and his prim wife. After this humiliation, Turpin becomes the Bow Street Runners' most wanted man, and therefore Captain Fancy is assigned to go undercover and catch him. One night on a dark country road, a coach is held up by Dick Turpin. This coach contains Madame Desiree and her birds of paradise. But with the Bow Street Runners in close pursuit, and they even mucked that one up, Dick Turpin managed to outsmart the runners and send them away in Madame Desiree's coach. Strap and Desmond Fancy go to Upper Denshire, where most of the hold-ups have been happening. They confide in the rector of the local church, whose identity seems very similar to Dick Turpin, which they haven't sussed out at this point. They feed in confidence some rather vital information on how they're going to capture Dick Turpin. They agree to meet at the seedy Old Cock Inn, a notorious hangout for criminals and sleazy types. Fancy and Strap pose as two men on the run to gather information, but don't really get what they came in for. In fact, Strap gets more than he bargained for. The only clue they get is that Dick Turpin has a rather peculiar birthmark on his diddler. With that in mind, and the rector getting wind of this, he sweet talks Desiree into assisting him in capturing Dick Turpin. He tells her that Captain Fancy is Turpin and must be proved that he has a birthmark on his diddler. Whilst they're not able to prove that, Strap and Fancy send a message to Sir Roger Daley about the birthmark, and is accosted by Harriet in disguise, who tells them to meet Dick Turpin at night at 10 o'clock under the blasted oak. This of course leads to another Turpin trap. However, things start to rapidly fall apart for Dick Turpin at the local jumble sale. Items of interest and a rather sordid story told to his housekeeper about Mrs. Giles seems to basically put Dick Turpin at the forefront of all these crimes. With all this information, Fancy, Strap and Daley go to the church, where the Reverend is giving one of his Sunday services. Whilst they can't disturb him during one of these services, they wait for the right time, but seem to wait a little bit too long. An escape plan has been sought by Dick Turpin, sending the constable to the floor, jockstrap into the air, and a rather erroneous fire alarm that basically gets him out of there. This then aids them to get across the border to safety and get into wee bonny Scotland. And that's the end of the film. Carry On Dick was released on the 12th of July 1974. And whilst we say goodbye to a few of the classic stars of the series, it sits in that period of carry-ons when they weren't at their peak. The films were changing, along with the attitudes and the time that it was made in. Some see Carry On Dick as the last really good Carry On film. Some see it as one of the weakest historical adventures that the team have ever done. It's a very, very mixed bag Carry On. The script only kind of semi-delivers the hilarities that some of the other classics have produced. And it appears that everyone is on a rather slow and tiresome performance. The film itself is considered to be quite an average carry-on. It's nowhere near bad, it's nowhere near good, and it would probably sit somewhere in the middle if you had to rank them. But the film does provide some very timed gags, and really does emphasise on maybe Sid's very, very final carry-on film, which seemed poignant at the time. This film has some of the high points and some low points. And whilst, yes, it's never going to be the greatest carry-on, it's a watchable feast of fun and gags that will entertain you for a mere 90 minutes. Until next time, carry on laughing.